to the inaugural Conference on Innovations to Tackle Global Sustainability Challenges, hosted by the Centers for International Business Education and Research, the CIBERs at Indiana University, Georgia Tech, and the George Washington University. My name is Anna Helm, and I'm the faculty director of the Jeffery CIBER at the George Washington University School of Business. I speak for all three centers when I tell you how delighted we are to bring together such an impressive group of scholars to exchange ideas around innovations and sustainability and share with our audience insights drawn from cutting-edge research in international business and related fields. Before I introduce you to our conference chair, Stephanie Wang, I'd like to say a few words about the network of CIBERs around the country. There are 15 centers, all funded by a Title VI grant from the US Department of Education, with a broad mandate to help increase US competitiveness abroad. To this effect, we support international business research, design and offer educational experiences for students, and engage in outreach with business and policy communities. Each CIBER largely designs its own activities, but we also serve as regional and national resource centers by collaborating on numerous initiatives with other CIBERs, including the support of minority-serving institutions such as historically Black colleges and universities in their efforts to internationalize their curricula and research. We also provide assistance to community colleges and high schools. Of particular importance to the Department of Education is our work to advance the field of business language studies and the development of business language teaching capacity and materials. Ultimately, the CIBERs around the country form a powerful network focused on meeting the demands of US firms for competent, globally minded talent and up-to-date knowledge about international business. I would now like to introduce our program chair, Stephanie Wang from Indiana University, who has spearheaded this conference with the help of our co-organizers from Georgia Tech and GW, John McIntyre and Robert Ortung. I have to tell you that we were very excited to collaborate with Stephanie on this project, given that she had participated in our Summer Doctoral Institute not too long ago as a budding scholar. Stephanie has since won numerous awards, such as the International Management Division Emerging Scholar Award at the Academy of Management in 2019, the Academy of International Business AIB Best Paper Award in 2018, and the Woman AIB Emerging Scholar Award in 2017. We really appreciate Stephanie's leadership in designing much of the conference and lining up such an impressive group of scholars. Over to you, Stephanie.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. Again, on behalf of all three CIBERs, welcome to our inaugural conference on innovations to tackle global sustainability challenge. It was really my great honor to serve as the program chair. I know we are excited for the conference, but before we dive into our very first session, I'd like to take a minute to really highlight our overall program. So as you have seen in this year, our virtual conference, we feature talks and discussions by leading scholars in this area and some corporate executives. We are aware of Zoom fatigue, so we keep our conference short but exciting. So among them, for the very first time, we feature special discussions and debates dedicating to understand the differences and collaborations between entrepreneurs and multinationals, which is our first panel today. We also have another panel focusing on debates and collaborations between developed and developing multinationals. And we have two keynote talks focusing on how our scholarly research can better understand multinationals' urgent challenges, such as inclusive supply chain, and how we scholars can provide better policy implications. And we also recognize the multidisciplinary nature of this research area. So we feature a panel discussion between strategy IB scholars, with scholars studying natural science and climate change and others. And last but not least, we also have a practitioner panel who we can listen to what firms are actually doing and how we scholars can help them. So I sincerely hope you can enjoy our conference. So now let's move to the exciting part, our very first panel, focusing on organizational sustainability initiatives, multinationals, and entrepreneurs. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to put the questions in chat for now. We will have Q&As later at the end of our panel discussion. So as you can see, we have 4 prominent scholars here who need no introduction, right? And we also have their full bio. We shared with you in the bio notes, so you can take a careful look. So I'm just going to highlight a few among many of their achievements, right? So first, Jonathan Dahl from Villanova University. So we know that Jonathan is currently general editor of Journal of Management Studies, and also the former editor-in-chief of Journal of World Business. He's also a fellow of AIB, Academy of International Business, one of the most honorable recognition in the IB field, and also an Academy of Management Research Fellow as well, AOM Fellow. And Anne Kolk from University of Amsterdam. She's an recognized expert in corporate social responsibility. She received the EABIS award, which is a life achievement award recognized exceptional faculty who are leaders in integrating environmental social issues with their research and teaching. And Jeff, my colleague here at Kelley School of Business, is the David Jacob Chair in Strategic Entrepreneurship. And we know that Jeff is the editor-in-chief of Journal of Business Venturing, the top journal in entrepreneurship. And his work has been highly cited in the area of commercial, social, sustainable, and development entrepreneurship. And last but not least, Karl, right? Sauvant, we all receive reading his emails about investment. Karl from Colombian University, and he's also a fellow of AIB and also an honorary fellow of EBA, European International Business of Academy. Karl is the founding executive director at the Colombia Center on Sustainable International Investment. So again, this is a very brief introduction. They have among a few highlights among many of their achievements. So today we are going to focus on 3 sets of questions. So the panelists will share their insights among the 3 questions. First, what topics on organizational sustainability initiatives are you recently working on or most excited about? Why are you interested in studying them? And second, what are the challenges of conducting scholarly research on this area? And what are your recommendations to overcome those challenges? And last, do you see any opportunities for IB scholars and entrepreneurship scholars to collaborate on this topic? And if yes, what are the potential research questions? If not, what are the barriers? So we're going to start from the first set of questions. We are going to go with the honor of Jonathan, Anne, Jeff, and Karl. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. It's a delight to be with you and all of my colleagues and friends virtually, I guess, for a little while. We'll hopefully be seeing each other in not too long a time. So let me first thank the 3 partners, GW, Indiana University, and Georgia Tech for coming together at this symposium, this workshop. I think it's a really great topic. And more broadly, it's very encouraging to see all the activity at the intersection of international business, sustainability, and entrepreneurship or innovation. And these include a lot of different initiatives and activities, including a special issue I'm involved in at JIBS. But I also want to give a quick plug to a new initiative of the Academy of International Business, and that is the Sustainability Shared Interest Group, the Sustainability SIG, led by John Dilliard and Shasha Zhao, who are with us here today. So maybe at some point, one of them could put in the chat a link to the Shared Interest Group at AIB that is really focused on these issues. So in terms of the topics or the interests that I've been focusing on recently, for those of you that know a little bit about my work, I've been very interested in cross-sectoral collaboration and partnerships. So different types of collaborative initiatives between and among multinationals, NGOs, and governments. And more recently, I've been looking at climate change adaptation through the lens of those kinds of partnerships. And a paper published in 2019 with Pete Tashman and Mirko Benischke in the Academy of Management Perspectives, we developed this concept of collective environmental entrepreneurship as a way to forge resource collaboration between and among these partners in tackling the challenges of climate change adaptation. Just as a quick aside, climate change is going to be with us. As much as we hope the Paris Treaty, moves ahead and that mitigation efforts have some effect, the reality is we live on a warming planet, and we're going to have to get used to that as firms, as individuals, as organizations. So at any rate, this paper kind of developed some theory and ideas around this notion of collective environmental entrepreneurship. More recently, another paper with Mirko and Pete looks at climate risk and innovation. And we draw a connection between countries that are experiencing climate risk and the increasing innovations that firms in those countries pursue related to climate adaptation. And this is something that we've been working on and will continue to work on and hope to see in an outlet sometime soon. And then finally, a newer project looking at climate change adaptation among Colombian coffee growers. Coffee, as you know, is grown at high altitudes, but as the climate warms, it's going to have to be grown at even higher altitudes. And so there's a lot of adaptive activity going on in the coffee industry as well as other agricultural industries. And that project's along with Maria Andrea de Villacorrea down in Colombia, along with the Trade Association in Colombia, Senecafe. And I would say all these projects involve some aspect of cross-border multinational activity. They all clearly involve some element of sustainability, and they all also include some type of innovation or entrepreneurial activity. So that's what I've been up recently, and I look forward to hearing from others. Again, thanks so much, Stephanie, for hosting us.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ans?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Exciting to be here. So I was actually struck. What struck me in the title of this panel was that it was multinationals versus entrepreneurs, and I thought that, well, to realize sustainability, you need to have both. And also part of my work has been on social entrepreneurship and nonprofit entrepreneurship, in addition, of course, to looking at IB and multinationals. So I think it's really the combination of the two. One of the things I've been working recently, but it's actually something that's been working on since the late 1990s, is climate change and the energy transition. At the time, it wasn't really called the energy transition. I've done some work on adaptation, like Jonathan mentioned, but also on mitigation, climate change mitigation, firm responses to climate change. And interestingly, this is a stream that has never ended, and that has been revived very recently through, the special issue that JIBS had on this topic, but also emerging policy interest. Now, what is interesting about this topic is that you can also see that while we were traditionally talking about fossil fuel based companies, so large incumbents, now we're also talking about small and big tech companies. So also small digital ventures that can really make a difference in this area. So we're talking about not just country-specific advantages and firm-specific advantages, as we would call it in the international business literature, but you also have, as we published in a recent paper, business model-specific advantages. And this is a huge area of research that I'm very excited about, also because you can not seeing the big tech companies entering this realm, but also all sorts of small firms that come up with digital platform-based business models. And there's another area where I'm working on where you can see, like in the case of, we had a paper about what we call sustainability-oriented digital platform multinationals. So these are really these small ventures that are helping to address this, the sustainable development goals through all sorts of different initiatives, also in developing countries. And I think this is also another truly exciting and huge area of research.
Great, thanks, Ans. Karl.
You call on me or Jeff?
Yes, sorry,
Oh,
Karl.
I'm sorry, I thought it was Jeff. Sorry. Well, thanks again. Thanks for the invitation. And
oh, that was actually my fault, Jeff. So sorry.
Oh, go
Jeff,
ahead, Karl.
yeah.
Karl's ready to go. So either way, it's fine. Okay. I'll go then. That's fine. So everybody's been talking about kind of the research they've been doing. I want to talk about kind of maybe the research I am working on or I'm thinking of moving into. And a couple of the questions that I guess inform that are like, what can entrepreneurial resourcefulness under extreme scarcity reveal to us about conditions required for sustainable development? For example, do you need a certain base amount of resources in order to sustain innovation for the next wave of economic growth and such. And we kind of take it for granted that we will have enough natural resources to make those investments in uncertainty and under extreme ignorance. And that's not the case if you're in extreme scarcity, or you don't have a lot of natural capital to work with. For example, if you are in the biosphere, or if you are going to Mars, for example, with SpaceX, you have nothing but what you take with you, and it's all purposed, and it's very difficult to innovate or to come up with any kind of novelty in those conditions when you have no resources whatsoever to spare, and everything that you take with you has to regenerate itself, or is not man-made at all, is not natural at all, so it can't regenerate. So it's got to basically, entropy is by design. Everything's going to be used up as you try to create anything from that. Can economic growth and ecological sustainability be compatible, and under what conditions? So this is a perennial theme that we've seen in this space, but it's one that we have not really answered yet. We typically talk about it in a theoretical sense, but we don't really look at it empirically. And I actually think trips to Mars, like SpaceX is trying to do, or the biosphere, is another example of, can we do this even in a bubble? We couldn't do it in the biosphere, and yet we think we can do it on a planetary level. But these are actually empirical experiments that could be run, where can you create a sustainable community within here on Earth before, and what lessons can we learn from expanding that beyond a contained environment? Given that our notions of business performance are grounded in accounting and economics, when we talk about financial measures and such, and those in turn are grounded in Newtonian physics, which is a closed system, how is pure profit possible? This is a highly theoretical question. But if we don't know where profit comes from, what the source of profit is, and by the way, we don't. If you read it, if you go heavy into economic theory, it does not actually tell you where the profit comes from. It tells you how profit is realized, but not really the source of where that profit originates. It typically comes from natural resources. If you go back far enough, typically solar energy, if you want to go back far enough in the cycle. And we typically treat assets as if they're dead things. So once you use them, they're gone. But there are types of accounting, like, for example, livestock, where you have to preserve a certain amount so that you can regenerate the herd and such. And we don't use those kinds of accounting enough in our type of organizational studies, which we could do. And why am I interested in this? A couple things. I grew up in the Lincoln National Forest in New Mexico, so I was surrounded by the forest. I love it. I think it's important. And then there's a scene from a movie, and Evan Almighty. It's a funny movie, but it shows what the Earth looked like before all the development and then after. And I think if people could see how much things have changed in a moment in time, it really horrifies them how much of our natural environment is gone. I've lived in Bloomington for 12, 13 years. There were forests in places that are gone now. And you would only know that if you've been here for that long. If I just moved here and I'd only been here 6 months, I wouldn't know. I'd think it always looked like this. And I guess that's what disturbs me, because from somebody from the Southwest where there's no trees, when I see a tree just taken down needlessly, it just kills me, because it's something that was so precious out there. So I guess that's my why.
Thanks, Jeff. Now, Karl, your turn. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, one of the issues I'm working on relate to sustainable foreign direct investment for sustainable development. And I'm looking at it, and I think that picks up on what Stephanie said about how can you divide and come up with policy recommendations that can take your research forward. Now, why sustainable foreign direct investment? Well, sustainable foreign direct investment is really all about the impact at the project level. After all, that's where the rubber hits the road, and where foreign direct investment, which after all amounts to something like $1.5 trillion a year these days, can make a contribution, for good or bad, to development. I'm arguing that projects need to have certain characteristics to make a reasonable contribution to the economic, social, and environmental development of host countries, and I'm focusing on host countries, although one could deal with home countries, and that take place within the framework of reasonable governance mechanisms. So these characteristics, what kind of projects make the best possible contribution to sustainable development? The obvious question then is, how do you identify these characteristics? And for me, the solution is pretty straightforward. You look at what host countries say they expect from foreign direct investment. And you also look at what companies say they bring to host countries. And if you do that, you actually find that there is quite some overlap, and quite a number, and this overlap involves such characteristics like local linkages, low carbon footprint, labor rights, human rights, supply chain standards, and things like that. There are more. So we actually know what countries say they want to advance the development, and what companies say they bring to the country. So the next question is, how do you promote that these type of characteristics are actually enhanced as much as possible, without, of course, making a particular project unprofitable? I guess one way of doing it is that multinationals can commit themselves to CSR, to corporate social responsibility. Actually, I prefer responsible business conduct because it has a broader implication. Problem is, whatever we know, practically all efforts to promote corporate social responsibility or responsible business conducts are voluntary. That has its limitations. Don't have to go into it. It has been increasingly recognized, as we know from the work of the OECD on base erosion and profit shifting, the BEPS work, which is seeking to deal with the propensity of firms to avoid taxes, to shift profits, and all the rest of it. So that's one way. And it goes already in the direction of what is another way, namely to get corporate social responsibility provisions or sustainable investment provisions into binding international investment agreements, especially bilateral investment treaties. And bilateral investment treaties are important because they are enforced effectively to investor-state dispute settlement. And there are a number of ways in which this can be done. And I think that, in turn, gives opportunity to actually try to advance a research agenda. First, in terms of working out how sustainable FDI characteristics, or how, let's put it more general, how the impact of foreign direct investment on the development, on the sustainable development of host countries can be enhanced. And then secondly, how it can be taken forward into the policy space through policy advocacy in order to move the sustainable development agenda in general forward. I think there's plenty of space for more research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all our panelists sharing the research topics, coming from different angles, different research contexts, different levels of analysis, which basically provided us many examples of potential research questions. So let's move on to the second question. I noticed that earlier somebody were raising hands for questions. So if you have any questions, please put in chat. We have people monitor the questions. We will have our Q&As at the end of all three set of questions. Okay. All right, so the second set of questions, what are the challenges of conducting scholarly research on organizational sustainability initiatives? And what are your recommendations to overcome such challenges? So we are going to follow the orders of Ans, Jeff, Karl, and Jonathan. So Ans, floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, well, so one of the issues, so I've been working on these topics already for quite some years. One of the great things is that all sorts of scholars are joining forces to improve our understanding. The disadvantage of this is that it's in many fields, a lot of these topics have already been studied, and it's very interdisciplinary, and that brings a huge amount of challenges for all of us, because I mean it's literally impossible to cover all these different fields. So for example in climate change and energy, but I mean that also applies. I did a couple of review papers, for example, with regard to poverty alleviation. I mean, there's been huge streams of literature that we as business scholars or as international business scholars may not be aware of, because I mean, it's in public policy, it's in economics, there's a huge sustainability and energy area. So, I mean, regardless of what topic you take, I mean, there are usually environmental scientists and social scientists, governance scholars. I mean, so there are many people, and so that is one of the challenges I think we all face when we're doing these types of research. The other one is that there's also conceptualization is also very messy. So, I mean, there's new terms coming in every time, and there's a history to all those debates, let alone be it sustainability, be it corporate social responsibility, ethics, business ethics. Well, any term you come up with has a long history, and so it's you need to find a way to deal with this. Now, a key approach to this that I always try to take is simply define very properly what you're talking about and where you get it from. That is, of course, very helpful. How you solve the huge interdisciplinarity. I mean, you also need to find a way for yourself to be aware of what's going on and to really delve deep into one topic without trying to do broad strokes of everything, I think. Then, of course, the other thing is that there's a very long history of all these things. So, I mean, it's not only the breadth and the depth, but it's also, you know, the length of the people studying all this. So that's another challenge. I don't think in general there is a good answer to doing this, but the only thing is that, yeah, what I always feel is that you need to find for yourself the field and the topics that you're most interested in, and the types of scholars that you want to contribute, that you want to collaborate with. So I think that is perhaps a good driver for people who are working in this area. Then another thing is lack of good data, depending on the topic that you take. So sometimes, of course, topics are driven by the fact that there are data, but especially when you're inspired by a particular topic and want to help solve global sustainability challenges, then usually you're at sort of the frontier of different types of topics. Here again, there's no clear solution. I mean, I've had for example, a review paper in Journal World Business where we came up with a couple of databases and data sources that you can consult and that people may not be aware of. It also applies if you look to other fields, for example, economics, where they've sometimes been using different types of data sets that we could perhaps use better. And of course, another alternative is, well, not very applicable in COVID times, but outside you can go out, right? You can go out in the field, you can talk to people. I mean, so there's all sorts of ways in which you can collect as many secondary data as well, especially digital methods really help nowadays. And then finally, because I mean, we do have a time limit, I think one of the challenges is also the publishing landscape. So the outlets that you have. So, I mean, we have our great and established journals, but at the same time, I mean, at least in many places, there is a drive to publish in open access journals. And then, of course, it becomes a muddy field of all sorts of from predatory journals to decent journals and everything in between. That is a very difficult area to navigate in. I mean, except if you're at a school where there's simply very clear guidelines, you should publish in this and that. But especially if you want to have policy impacts, as well as academic impact, that I think is an important challenge. I'm not sure how to overcome this. I mean, I'm trying to help juniors and also to help my university navigate this, but this is something that we need to face. And of course, I mean, in addition to that, you can have a lot of, I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which you can have a policy and practitioner impact. But in the area of academic publishing, I think this is also one of the challenges. So let me stop here.
Thanks, Anne. So we need to be aware the depth, the breadth, and the length of the research. So we need to know the boundary, the definitions, different terminologies. We need to foster dialogues among different disciplines. And we need to be aware of maybe look for variety of data and be more innovative in terms of data collection approach. And last, talk a little bit about mindful about the publication outlets. We have two editor-in-chief. Maybe they can talk a little bit on this. All right, Jeff.
Yeah, so those were just amazing points. Definitely, I'd say, before I was editor-in-chief, I was field editor, and sustainability was one of my areas. And one of the problems that you do get regularly in this space is they're models of the world. So you get this paper, somebody wants to write a Tolstoy novel and publish it in 30 pages, and you can't do it. And as somebody who loves to do that or try to do that, it's just impossible, because you are open to ambiguities in too many spaces, whether it's terminology, I sympathize I empathize in this case, because you're trying to draw from 2 or 3 different areas, and you have to define the language. You can't assume anything is taken for granted, because these are different communities coming together, and you still are facing the 30-page constraints. So how to deal with this is an extreme challenge. It is one of the struggles that there are no easy answers here, in the sense that if you're drawn to this topic, it's something you're just going to wrestle with your entire career, and you've got to just accept that. And start to figure out, okay, how can I make my research question as precise as possible? And how can I somehow go narrow here and deep so that I can have that kind of breadth, but yet the question can contain it and make it possible for me to answer that at a 30-page paper? Extremely difficult. I just sent Stephanie a paper asking for a friendly review, and I've been working on this thing forever, and it was still 30 pages, single space. So I was like, it's already twice the page. And after rereading it, I told her not to look at it again, because I realized it's 3 papers. I'm gonna have to break it up into 3 papers. Why is this so challenging? I think there's a couple issues. The terminology is absolutely part of the problem, is the figuring out which terminology you're going to use, because many of these concepts can be framed in many different ways. You can talk about the same item, maybe sometimes the same construct, but with 5 different labels. And so you have to choose which label is going to be the one that you're going to use. And that's largely determined by your audience, like to whom are you trying to reach? So that's something you have to really think about. Levels of analysis are really difficult here, because this is an inherently multi-level phenomena. And so part of the problem is reviewers always say, choose your level of analysis. And I'm like, yeah, if it were that easy, it would have been done. Thank you very much for your amazing advice. But part of it is, a lot of times you're talking about the individual level, the firm level, maybe the economy level and societal levels all at the same time. And you're trying to figure out, how can I do that again in 30 pages, which it's very frustrating at times. One way I dealt with it, I started out years ago thinking about this idea for a theory, and I used Robinson Crusoe for a while, and it had shortcomings in it. And now I've moved to using Mark Watney from the Martian, because he was all things in one. He was the only individual. He's the firm. He's society all at one time, and I could use him to illustrate boundary conditions and stuff without having to point all those out, because we take so much for granted when you do things on Earth. There's just abundant resources, natural resources, and people don't even realize it, because we're like fish in the water. We don't see the water. We don't even recognize that it's everywhere. So that was one creative way that I was trying to solve it, to get quickly to the point. And I think there's some other issues that we deal with. One is, it is interdisciplinary in the sense that, we're drawing, like in that paper, I'm drawing from environmental economics, critical accounting, sustainability, entrepreneurship, theory of the firm. I'm like, so it's very hard on readers to figure out to which conversation are you trying to extend or contribute to. And many times you feel like you're trying to actually start a conversation. That is the hardest of all academic tasks, is to start a conversation where it wasn't before. when I wrote my paper with Tom Dean on theory of sustainable entrepreneurship, we had nothing. There was nothing out there. So we had to borrow as much as we could from another field, bring that in from environmental economics, but then tie it or come up with some kind of interest level in the field of entrepreneurship. And it was difficult. It was a jump start. You had to basically create a conversation where it didn't exist before by cobbling as many people as you can, allies together, that you thought might be interested. And typically when you do that, the papers do get traction. They are well read. There is interest out there, but it takes time and it takes a lot of patience. And I think our incentives are not aligned with that in many cases. I mean, it's like, what's the next paper? How many papers can you get out this month? You know, that kind of thing. And that is definitely a different incentive system. So if you're drawn to this kind of research, you might want to take a portfolio approach where the things that you really care about that you know are going to take time and offset those with some that you know are doable, that are manageable, so that you can be here tomorrow and have a career, yet still do the kind of research you really know matters and you really care about. And that's the only way I've been able to kind of manage those competing incentives through this process. So I'm going to stop there and I'll turn it over to Karl.
Thanks, Jeff. Karl.
Thank you. Well, let me respond to this question, not by focusing on challenges concerning research, but rather what to do with the research once you have done it. In other words, impact and policy recommendation, to pick up on you again, Stephanie. The assumption is, of course, it's not a safe assumption, I realize that you don't just want to have your research published, but also you want to make a difference in the real world. That means research needs to be policy oriented. And we know that most people in academia are very good in describing, very good in analyzing, but it becomes more complicated when you then are being asked, okay, what concretely needs to be done in order to move the agenda forward? So that means you have to develop policy recommendations, or at least options, and you need to bring them to the attention of policymakers. Otherwise, they just sit on the shelf. Let me give you just an example. In the WTO is still a very significant institution. You have currently very active negotiations, among others, on electronic commerce, on SMEs, and also on investment facilitation. The idea is to have an agreement, a binding agreement by this November. Of course, they won't reach it, but nevertheless, on investment facilitation for development. And it focuses very much on technical matters, technical issues related to investment facilitation, all sorts of issues that IB scholars should be familiar with, right? Transparency, streamlining procedures, even issues related to corporate social responsibility and things like that. So what kind of measures are particularly important? What are the negotiators supposed to put into an agreement? And keep in mind, these are trade negotiators who really don't know that much about foreign direct investment. So they would need advice. And if you want to bring in not only the dimension, if you don't only want to strengthen the dimension of facilitating investment, but if you want to actually bring in measures, facilitation measures that directly increase the development impact, what would you deal with? What would you suggest negotiators should put into an agreement? What about the idea of a recognized sustainable investor, for example, or other possibilities that we who are working on sustainability issues are aware of, but need to be translated literally into treaty language that is acceptable in addition to 164 members. So all of this, raises the question, how can you influence, how can you have policy impact? And as Anne's pointed out, the reward structure for people in IB and in other disciplines isn't really very favorable to move on and focus on policy impact. I guess you have to be retired like myself in order to have the luxury to deal with things that that don't count towards tenure or whatever. So my suggestion is that to the extent that people can afford it, it is important to deal with policy implications and to work with negotiators and with people on the ground, concretely, for instance, representatives of investment promotion agencies, as to what could be done. And if I may pick up in this context, Stephanie, the question that John asked in the chat box. He's asking, are there types of M&Es originating in certain home cultures that are more likely to engage in outbound FDI that is aggressively sustainable and responsible? I don't think there are M&Es, or at least I can't generalize. However, I can say that a number of home countries have put in place, within the framework of the regulatory framework, mechanisms that say, we support your outward investment, including by providing risk insurance or financial incentives or any other type of support, provided you do certain things which are good for host country development. For example, environmental impact studies. So this is a very good example of where one could literally, in the US, for example, and the US has a mechanism where one can make an input, could suggest, in order for the US to provide certain advantages and support for outward investment, you need to establish conditionality that is based on sustainability characteristics. So what would be this what could be these conditions? What could be these conditions, and how could you get them into the law?
Thank you, Karl. I think you gave us point out a great direction how to find a great conversation audience, policymakers, so that we can target our research to the audience, to the targeted audience. I like both you and Jeff pointed out the potential risk of conducting research like this. We do have a lot of doctor, student, and junior faculty in our audience. So thank you for pointing that out. All right, Jonathan, your turn.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick here. So maybe just to echo some of what's already been said, I think Ans and Jeff both talked about the multidisciplinary nature of these topics by definition and the multi-levels. And I think when you combine multidisciplinary and multi-level, that by definition is challenging. More broadly, way back when I started doing some of this work, especially around NGOs, there was some skepticism in the international business scholarly community about whether NGOs, not-for-profits, had any business being studied as part of the international business landscape. And we received a lot of pushback, those of us that were interested in that. Thankfully, that has changed. I think it's an open season now for exploring these kinds of topics. Just a quick comment on what Jeff was saying in terms of terminology. So when I started looking at NGOs, my sociology colleagues said, "Oh, you mean SMOs, social movement organizations?" And my political science colleagues said, "Oh, do you mean interest groups?" So right there and then, there's kind of at least three different definitions or descriptions of this phenomenon. And so I would underscore Jeff's comment there as well. So maybe just add a couple quick ones in above and beyond what others have already mentioned. Number one, the dependent variable of interest. As much as things have shifted and moved, I still think that in strategy generally, and especially in international business strategy, we still are interested in financial performance of one sort or another. And so if we have some research that really looks at a completely different type of dependent variable, I think sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to get it through the review process because it's really easy to kind of take this reductionist approach and try to boil everything down to financial performance. Secondly, as an editor, I can say there is a relatively limited number of reviewers because there are a relatively limited number of scholars working in this area. And so I tend to go back to the same people over and over. And if you're on the call here, thank you and apologies. But having said that, I think there are these growing scholarly communities. In addition to the SIG that I mentioned, the sustainability SIG, there are a couple dedicated groups like ARCS, the Association for Research and Corporate Sustainability, or Groningen, or others, the O&E division at the Academy that focus on these topics. So that's getting a little better as well. Then finally, I'll just echo something that Ans said, or extend a little bit. And that is that I think many sustainability topics benefit from field work, but field work is hard. It takes a long time, and it's kind of high risk, high reward. So if you're going to invest in a 1 or 2 or 3 year study where you're really rolling up your sleeves and literally getting dirty, the payoffs are not always obvious. Having said that, I think there's some people working in the space that are doing tremendous work. Not so much me, but I'll mention a couple of them, like Jeff Kistrick, Ted Baker, Sophie Bach, who's now at IU. Here are some people that are doing that, and it is paying off for them. So there's a couple challenges, but I guess also opportunities. Thanks.
Great. All right. So let's move to the last set of questions. Do you see, Anne's already kind of like touched upon that. So do you see opportunities for IB scholars and entrepreneurship scholars in particular, right? We know there are a lot of disciplines doing this type of research, but just for our panel as purpose, IB research and entrepreneurship research, how do we collaborate? And if yes, what are the potential research questions? And if no, what are the barriers? So we are going to go the order by Jeff, Karl, Jonathan, and Anne.
Yeah, so this was the hardest question. So
I just picking on you, Jeff.
No, I think that. So I was thinking about this, and I think the answer is absolutely. The answer is yes for collaboration. There's no doubt about that. But I was thinking about what are some of the difficult questions? I think one of them is just from some of the field work I've done, and Christine helped me with that. She's on the call as well. In Africa, working with Coca-Cola and with water health, and some of this is, I think that MNCs have such a high profile that they have to have a kind of a global standard, that they have a very difficult time sometimes with solutions that would work in a local setting, but they cannot roll those out because they're held to a higher standard. So for example, we were working on a water project, and some of the innovations that were possible locally just would not have been possible for Coca-Cola. If there'd been plastic sachet bags with clean water, it would have wrecked Coca-Cola to see trash around that had the Coca-Cola symbol on that, even though it was a substantial improvement over and above what was happening locally there. And that was an option that they could not entertain if you're an MNC, but you could have perhaps if you're a local entrepreneur, and then you'd come up with a program to clean that up or whatever. And there was a difficulty there that I recognized in working with them, that they just couldn't take certain chances. There were certain things that they couldn't even try for fear that the watchdog groups would get them. And I started to wonder then, is perfection the enemy of better? In many cases, if I can't have the perfect outcome or the perfect solution, I can't step up the ladder. And I'm not saying that the step would be a better option there, but it couldn't be entertained. You couldn't even weigh those two options out to see which is the better approach. And the one danger I see in the sustainability research many times is if we don't know exactly what sustainable is and we don't have a clear definition of it, it becomes very difficult to make those judgment calls, because I can't evaluate the two prospects because I don't know what sustainability is. And if it keeps getting moved by whomever chooses, like if it's a protest group or whatever, and they have a different definition than you have, the fear of hypocrisy is so high, it makes people not want to try anything at all. For example, P&G came over to IU years back, and I talked to them, and their officer in that space, and his biggest fear is that if we make any stance and we put our name out there as a green product or a sustainable product in any way, the first thing we know is somebody's going to look for every instance where that's not the case. So it makes them not want to do it at all, which is exactly the opposite of what we would like to see. We want people to try, even if it's not going to succeed. And how to wrestle with that is extremely difficult. I think it's something that MNCs and entrepreneurs can work together on. They might be able to do this through partnerships. There might be collaborations. And that's what we saw with Coca-Cola. They were working with local entrepreneurs there. We're working with water health on the ground in Ghana. And that allowed them to invest more like almost like a venture capitalist investing in small local entrepreneurs, and then those local entrepreneurs instituted some of the solutions. So it became a much more collective enterprise, like Jonathan was probably referring to with this collective entrepreneurship notion. It took much more of a partnership and collaboration than we're used to seeing in probably either space alone. Turn it over.
Karl.
Thank you. Well, in line with what I've said so far, I'm sure you won't be surprised if I think that collaboration is not only necessary, but also that it has to involve scholars from other disciplines, and most importantly, also practitioners. And I echoed Jonathan's point that it's of course very difficult to do this type of collaboration across disciplines. Just to illustrate, I mean, I refer back to my points about corporate social responsibility and international investment agreements and bilateral investment treaties, and also to the WTO negotiations. One has to work with scholars dealing with international investment law. And that collaboration involves, at least to a certain extent, that one have to give them the substantive ideas of what is quality FDI, what is sustainable FDI, what kind of actions should governments take in order to get certain effects. And then the legal scholars can put that into the language that is needed to go into a law or into a treaty. The same thing applies if you work with people on the ground. For example, in investment promotion agencies, I mean, they would like to know, what kind of foreign direct investment to look for, what kind of quality foreign direct investment should they try to attract. OECD has started a whole project on quality FDI. What action should they take? How can they encourage it? What kind of incentives work? Most incentives don't really work because they're icing on the cake. What instruments can you use in order to elicit or encourage certain behavior? And, what are the obstacles? And so on and so on. For example, I mean, how do you design an effective linkage program between foreign affiliates and domestic firms? We know that backward linkages are one of the most effective avenues to transfer and transmit the tangible and intangible assets of foreign affiliates to domestic firms. So what would be an ideal linkage program? And a linkage program that is not perhaps super sophisticated, but would work in a developing country and maybe even in a least developed countries. Or how to establish a supplier database. After all, we know that firms do want to source locally, and the price is right, the conditions are right, quality is right. So how do you come up with a supplier database that is a reliable thing? I would think that investment promotion agencies in the least developed countries, as I mentioned the least developed countries a moment ago, might be particularly interested in getting this type of evidence-based, policy-oriented research, because they are typically extremely constrained in terms of the capacity they have. So this would be a very, obvious way to start. But there are also international organizations. I mentioned the OECD working on quality FDI. It is seeking input from the broader community, including from academia. You have tax inspectors without borders. So, they would most likely, again, welcome evidence-based research that identifies what multinational enterprises do in order to shift profits, avoid taxes, and how can you deal with it? So I think there are quite some opportunities for collaboration going beyond IB, and which could be extremely important in terms of moving the agenda forward. And I would certainly encourage everyone to take their research forward in that direction if they want to make a difference in the real world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karl. So Jonathan, and also since you are editor-in-chief, so I want to hear your perspective. Do you see any successful examples of collaborative work by IB and entrepreneurship scholars, or unsuccessful examples? If you can share any of those along this line.
So maybe I'll just talk in general principles. I think the one point I would want to share with you is that for a general management journal like Journal of Management Studies, the combination of IB and entrepreneurship would need to say something about broader general management theories. And I think there's high potential to be able to do that. But in this process of integration and recombination, there are different audiences we may be wanting to reach. And in a journal like JMS or AMJ or Journal of Management Studies, et cetera, there's a requirement or an expectation that the research will have something to say about a broader management theory. And I think by combining perspectives from different disciplines, there's definitely that opportunity. Maybe just a couple other quick points here. I meant to point out earlier, by the way, that this notion of collective environmental entrepreneurship that Pete and Mirko and I developed would have never happened without the notion of environmental entrepreneurship, which Dean and McMullen developed in 2007. So there's a way that non-entrepreneurship researchers, us, kind of borrowed this construct, this concept that had been developed in entrepreneurship, and then applied it in a different context. And I think there's an opportunity there to borrow and redeploy, if you will. And that's what we did. That's what I hope we were successful at it. And I think that's one kind of a metaphoric way of thinking about how this might work. And then finally, I just want to mention an area that I'm interested in, but I haven't done any research in, but others have. And that's the whole area of benefit corporations, or B Corps. I happen to be located here at Villanova, 2 miles down the road from B Lab, which is the organization that certifies B Corp. And I think B Corp are interesting for a couple different reasons. One, it's a real social movement. Two, it's going global. B Lab now has subsidiaries, I'm going to call it, or partner organizations in literally dozens of countries around the world. And we increasingly have B Corp and non-B Corp mixing it up through acquisitions and other kinds of cooperative activity. So we've had a bunch of non-B Corps acquire B Corps, like Unilever's acquisition of Ben & Jerry's and a bunch of others. But we also recently had a B Corp, Natura, acquire a non-B Corp, Amway. So here we have cross-border elements. We have social innovation, I'm going to call it. And we have interesting questions around integration, which is something that I think both entrepreneurship and international business scholars are interested in. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, Jonathan. And
yeah, thank you. So if I look strictly at the question, so the opportunities for IB scholars and entrepreneurship scholars to collaborate, let's recognize that there are people working on this, right? So there are people in international entrepreneurship, and there are people working, well, some people publish on international social entrepreneurship and on international new ventures. At this very same time, there is a conference on international entrepreneurship in Odense going on. So there are people working on this. What I see as the problem, if I take the perspective of an IB scholar, then of course, having published on entrepreneurial orientation of nonprofits and on social entrepreneurship in Africa, there's a huge and very rich literature in the entrepreneurship field. But it's very difficult. So, and it's indeed something that you can leverage, as Jonathan says. The problem is, of course, that if you want to bring it into the IB field, then it needs to be, more than just international, right? So, we all know these requirements of publishing in an IB journal or getting it into the IB field. So that means that my work on entrepreneurial activity of NGOs or social entrepreneurship has not been published in IB journals. But I think there is a huge opportunity there. But the problem, of course, is that these social enterprises, I saw one of the questions coming in, some of the social enterprises and also nonprofits sometimes behaving as entrepreneurs. This whole spectrum is usually local when you talk about sustainability issues. So and then, you really need to get it into IB, you really need to look at the collaboration or ways in which multinationals adopt practices, or as Jeff also referred to, and is implicit in the question that was posed in the chat. So I think that is one of the issues. At the same time, there's lots of areas where you can do this, because there are companies. I mean, especially that's why I mentioned these digital entrepreneurial ventures. I mean, they are by definition they can operate across borders. So that means that by definition they're more important, or can be more important for international business than let's say traditional social enterprises or entrepreneurial ventures. And I think there are lots of opportunities, especially if you connect it to the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, one of the papers I published, it wasn't on international NGOs, but food waste platforms. I mean, there are huge many entrepreneurial ventures, but they're usually small and locally bound, because I mean, if you want to circular approaches to food waste, well, these usually need to be local, right? So that wouldn't go into an international business. But of course, replication or scaling is something that could be an area where you could really come together. So there are opportunities, but perhaps more for publishing this in an entrepreneurship journal rather than publishing it in an IB journal.
Thank you, Anne. I recognize that we are actually out of time. So I do want to respect our panelists' time. So we already have a lot in our place. I want to thank you, all the panelists. Okay, Jeff, you already responded to the question. Perfect. I was just going to mention that. So thank you so much. That's great discussion. Yeah, so we have another keynote talk in about 15 minutes. So grab a lunch, take some break. Hopefully we can see you back. Thank you so much, Jonathan, Anne, Jeff, and Karl. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you. It was
Thank
a
you.
pleasure.